The moment Nellie Langley walked into the Silver Spur Saloon in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, every man inside went quiet, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she wore a gun belt over a calico dress, carried a leather satchel stuffed with surveying equipment, and had the look of a woman who had already decided she did not need a single soul in that room. She crossed the sawdust floor without glancing at anyone, dropped her satchel on the bar with a firm thud, and looked the barkeep square in the eye. His name was Hector Prout, a thick-necked man with a walrus mustache who had seen every manner of person come through that door over 12 years of pouring whiskey. "I need a room, a meal, and information about the Eastern Ridge land," Nellie said, her voice clear and unhurried. "In that order." Hector stared at her for a moment. "You alone, miss?" "That is generally what alone means, yes." A few men at the nearby tables laughed softly, not meanly but with genuine amusement, and Hector, to his credit, smiled and reached for a room key hanging on a peg behind him. Nellie Langley was 26 years old and had spent the last 4 years working as a land surveyor, a cartographer, and on 2 notable occasions, a witness in legal proceedings regarding disputed cattle ranges. She had grown up in Austin with a father who treated her like the son he never had, and a mother who had died of fever when Nellie was 11. Her father, James Langley, had taught her to read maps before she could properly braid her own hair, and by the time she was 18, she could calculate elevation changes and plot boundary lines with a precision that made the men at the Texas General Land Office feel quietly embarrassed. She had come to Dusty Creek because a widow named Clara Henshaw had written her a letter, shaking and desperate, claiming that a cattle baron named Warren Greele was trying to force her off land that had been legally deeded to her late husband. Clara needed someone who could prove the boundary lines, and Nellie was the best person in the state for that work. She had taken the train from Austin to San Antonio, and then ridden 2 days by horse to reach this small, sun-baked town wedged between limestone hills and a thin river that barely deserved the name. She ate her meal of beans and salt pork alone at a corner table, studying the rough sketches Clara had sent along with her letter, tracing her finger along the lines, and making small notations in the margin with a pencil she kept behind her ear. The saloon filled back up around her, men playing cards and drinking and talking about the rain that had not come and the cattle that were suffering for it. She paid them no mind. It was while she was squinting at a particularly unclear notation on Clara's sketch that a voice came from the chair across from her. "You have got that map upside down." Nellie did not look up immediately. She turned the sketch, considered it, turned it back, and then looked up with the level expression of someone who had been told they were wrong before and had survived it. The man sitting across from her was tall even while seated, with broad shoulders that filled out a worn canvas work shirt, dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes the color of creek water after rain, somewhere between gray and green and utterly impossible to pin down. He had a jaw that could have been carved from the limestone hills outside, and a mouth that looked like it smiled more often than not, though right now it was doing something between a smile and a question. "It is not upside down," Nellie said. "The surveyor who drew this simply started from the southern boundary instead of the northern, which is irregular but not wrong." The man looked at the sketch with genuine interest. "I see it now. Who drew it? That is my business." "Fair enough." He leaned back in his chair. "I am Clyde Carson. I run cattle on the western quarter of the county, and I have been in this saloon every Tuesday for the past 3 years, and I have never seen you before." "That is because I have never been here before." "What brings you?" Nellie looked at him with the direct, measuring gaze she had perfected for situations where a man was being charming and she needed to determine whether his charm was the harmless kind or the kind that came with a motive attached. Clyde Carson, she decided, looked like the harmless kind. He was not performing. He was simply curious, the way a person is curious when something genuinely interests them. "Work," she said. "What kind of work?" "Land surveying." Clyde's eyebrows rose slightly, not with skepticism but with what appeared to be actual interest. "You are a surveyor." "I am. I have been trying to get someone out here for 6 months to settle a boundary dispute with my neighbor to the north. The county surveyor retired and the new one is backed up until autumn." Nellie studied him for a moment. "I am here for a specific job. I cannot take on additional work at this time." "Understood." He nodded slowly, then stood and tipped his hat with the kind of easy grace that was not practiced but simply natural. "Well, Miss Langley, Nellie Langley. Miss Langley. If your current job wraps up sooner than expected, I would pay top dollar and I am not difficult to find. Everyone in Dusty Creek knows where the Carson Ranch sits." He gave that almost smile again. "Enjoy your supper." And he walked away. Nellie watched him go, then looked back at her map. She told herself she was noting the way he walked because she was an observant person by profession, not for any other reason. She moved into the room above the saloon that same night, unpacking her tools with methodical care. She had 2 compasses, a brass theodolite that had belonged to her father, a set of measuring chains, a journal with her notes from past surveys, and 3 changes of clothes, all practical. She hung her gunbelt on the bedpost and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of Dusty Creek settling in for the night. Horses at the hitching rail. A dog barking somewhere south of town. The piano in the saloon below playing something slow and sweet that seeped up through the floorboards like smoke. She thought about Clyde Carson for approximately 30 seconds before she made herself stop and go to sleep. The next morning she rode out to Clara Henshaw's property, which sat 3 miles east of town on land that rose gently toward the limestone ridge. Clara was a woman in her mid-50s, gray-haired and sturdy, with work-roughened hands and kind eyes that had been crying recently. She met Nellie at the gate of a modest homestead and gripped both of her hands with a warmth that felt like drowning and being pulled ashore at the same time. "Miss Langley, I cannot tell you what it means to me that you came." "Tell me everything," Nellie said, and they went inside. Over coffee that was too strong and a plate of biscuits that were very good, Clara laid it out. Her husband, Thomas Henshaw, had died 18 months ago of a heart ailment. He had purchased the land in 1874 from the county, and the deed was properly filed and recorded. But Warren Greele, whose ranch occupied the land to the south, had been claiming for the past 6 months that the eastern ridge and the creek that ran along it were not part of the Henshaw property at all, but had been incorrectly surveyed when the original deed was drawn, and therefore belonged to his range. The creek mattered because in a dry county, whoever controlled the water controlled everything. Greele had sent men twice to tear out the fence posts Clara had put up along what she believed was her eastern line. He had filed a complaint with the county that was still pending. And last month, one of his hands had told Clara directly that it would be easier for everyone if she just sold him the land and moved into town. "He is trying to wear me down," Clara said, and her jaw was firm even though her eyes were wet. "Thomas worked that land for 8 years. I will not hand it over to a man who thinks he can bully a widow into walking away." "He cannot bully you out of your legal property," Nellie said, "but we need to prove where the legal boundary actually sits. That means I will need to run a full survey of the eastern line, starting from the original survey points if I can find them. What if the original markers are gone? Then I use secondary reference points and the legal description in the deed, cross-reference with the county plat maps and build a case from there." She paused. "It is complicated work." Clara looked at her steadily. "Are you good at it?" "I am the best you are going to find west of Austin," Nellie said, with no particular pride in her voice, only the flat accuracy of someone stating a fact. She began the survey the following morning. She started at the northwest corner of the Henshaw property, which was marked by a limestone cairn that was still intact, and began working her way east along the northern boundary, taking measurements and recording them in her journal with careful, precise handwriting. The day was warm and the sky was the bright, hard blue of a Texas spring before the real heat comes. Mockingbirds argued in the cedar trees along the ridge, and the thin creek to the east made a sound like someone whispering. She was at the northeastern corner, trying to locate the original survey stake beneath a growth of brush, when she heard hoofbeats. 3 riders came from the south, riding slowly with the deliberate calm of men who want to be seen and want you to think about why you are seeing them. The one in front was heavyset with a square face and a trimmed gray beard. He wore a good hat and a jacket that cost more than Clara Henshaw's monthly expenses. Nellie recognized the type immediately, a man who had money and was used to it doing his persuading for him. "Miss Langley," the man said, pulling his horse up a respectful distance away. "I am Warren Greele. I heard you were out here." "News travels fast in small counties," Nellie said, not looking up from what she was doing. "I wanted to introduce myself and perhaps have a conversation." "I am working, Mr. Greele. This will not take long." His voice was the kind of smooth that had been practiced. "I want you to understand that this matter is more complicated than Clara Hensh has likely described. The original survey of this county was done in 1871 by a man named Porter, and I have reason to believe his eastern measurements were significantly off. I have my own documentation." Nellie stood up straight and looked at him directly. "If you have documentation regarding the original survey, you can submit it to the county along with your complaint, and it will be considered against whatever documentation I produce. That is how this process works. I am suggesting we might come to a more efficient resolution. I am not interested in efficient resolutions. I am interested in accurate ones." She held his gaze without blinking. "Good day, Mr. Greele." He looked at her for a long moment with eyes that had learned how to be cold without showing it. Then he tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away with his men, and Nellie went back to work. She found the original survey stake 20 minutes later, buried 6 inches under the brush, still solid iron and still stamped with the survey date of 1871. She measured from it with careful attention, her chain stretched tight and level on the uneven ground, and what she found made her sit back on her heels and look at the creek for a long moment. The creek was firmly within the Henshaw boundary. Greele's claim had no legal foundation whatsoever, but she needed to verify it all the way to the southern end before she could be certain, and that would take another 2 days at least. She packed her tools in the late afternoon and rode back toward town, already running the calculations in her head. She nearly ran her horse directly into Clyde Carson's. He was riding north along the road that paralleled the ridge, a roan gelding that was far better looking than its rider pretended not to notice. He pulled up quickly, and so did she, and for a moment they were close enough that she could see the specific color of those creekwater eyes. "Miss Langley," he said, with what she was beginning to recognize as genuine warmth rather than performance, "you survived your first day on the ridge." "The ridge was not threatening," she said, gathering her reins. "Warren Greele was a minor inconvenience." Clyde's expression shifted just slightly. "Greele came out to you. He introduced himself and suggested a more efficient resolution, which I declined." Clyde was quiet for a moment, and she noticed that his hands tightened once on his reins and then deliberately released. "Be careful with him, Miss Langley. Warren Greele is not a man who accepts no graciously." "I am aware of that type," Nellie said. "I do not doubt it, but out here he has reach. He employs a good portion of the county, and he has the ear of the county judge." He paused. "I am not trying to alarm you. I just think you should know the landscape." It was the second piece of genuinely useful information this man had offered her in 2 days, offered plainly and without any desire to have her owe him for it. Nellie found that difficult to dismiss. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Something in his expression softened very slightly, as if he had expected the information to be rejected along with the messenger. "Are you riding back to town?" "I am." "May I ride with you?" She considered refusing on principle, and then decided that was a foolish reason to refuse something. "If you can keep pace and not talk too much." He rode beside her in comfortable quiet for a while, which she appreciated. The road ran between old cedar fences, and the land smelled of dust and sage and the particular dry sweetness of South Texas in April. When he did speak, It was not about himself. "How did you come to survey land?" he asked. She told him about her father briefly and without sentiment. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He taught you well. He taught me everything I know about surveying, the rest I taught myself." That is a considerable amount of self-teaching. The alternative was knowing less, Nellie said. I was not interested in that option. Clyde laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that is surprised out of a person. It was a good sound. Nellie did not note this specifically. She noted it generally, the way you note when the weather is pleasant. They parted at the edge of town, him heading to the livery and her to the saloon, and Nellie went up to her room and sat at the small writing table and made her survey notes with rigorous attention to detail. It was only later, lying in the narrow bed listening to the piano below, that she thought about how easy it had been to ride beside him. How the silence had not been awkward but simply the natural silence of two people who were comfortable in their own thoughts. She told herself that was irrelevant. The second day of the survey went smoothly. She found 3 more of the original iron stakes along the eastern boundary, each one confirming what the first had suggested. The Henshaw line ran well east of where Greal claimed, encompassing the creek fully and completely. The survey Porter had done in 1871 was solid. Greal either knew his claim was false or had been lied to by someone who drew the maps for him. Either way, the documentary evidence was accumulating firmly on Clara's side. On the way back that afternoon, she stopped at a small rise and looked out over the county. She could see the Greal Range spreading south and west, vast and well-grassed even in the dry spring, the kind of spread that spoke of accumulated wealth and accumulated power. And she could see the modest Henshaw holding, smaller and less manicured but solid and legally sound. She thought about what it meant to have that kind of difference between neighbors. How easy it was, when you had Greal's resources, to decide that what was your neighbor's should be yours. She thought about the injustice of it with a clarity that was almost physical. She had seen it before in this work, the way wealth pressed against the boundaries of legality and sometimes found the gaps. But the law, applied properly, could hold. She intended to apply it properly. That evening, Clara came into town and they ate supper together at the small restaurant beside the dry goods store, a quieter place than the saloon with checked tablecloths and a menu chalked on a board. Clara asked about the survey's progress and Nellie told her, carefully and without overpromising, that the evidence was pointing strongly in her favor. Clara's eyes filled. Thomas always said the land was right. He said Porter did good work. Porter did very good work, Nellie said. What happens next? I finish the survey tomorrow, compile my report, and we take it to the county attorney. Your attorney in Austin should also receive a copy. With the original stakes, the deed, and my survey report, Greal's complaint should be dismissed. And if the county judge is in Greal's pocket, as people say, Nellie set down her fork, then we take it to the state level. I have testified before, Mrs. Henshaw. I know how to put survey data in front of people who need to understand it. This will not be quick, but it will be thorough, and thoroughness wins. Clara reached across the table and put her hand over Nellie's. You are a remarkable young woman. I am a competent professional, Nellie said, then softened slightly. But I appreciate the sentiment. She was walking back to the saloon when Clyde fell into step beside her. She had not heard him coming, which surprised her. She was generally very aware of her surroundings. Good evening, Miss Langley, he said. Mr. Carson, do you make a habit of appearing beside people on dark streets? Only people I am hoping to speak with. He matched her pace easily, his hat in his hand rather than on his head. I heard about what happened on the ridge. Greal's men were talking at the feed store. And what were they saying? That you were not cooperative. His tone was dry. That is one way to describe it. They walked in silence for a half-block. Around them, Dusty Creek was doing what small towns do in the evening, lamps being lit in windows, a dog sleeping in a doorway, the smell of someone's supper, the distant sound of cattle settling. Miss Langley, Clyde said carefully, I want to offer you something, and I want to be clear that there is no obligation attached to it. She looked at him sidelong. What is it? My foreman is also a good shot and a good man, and I would like to lend him to you for your final day of survey work on the ridge. Not to interfere with your work, only to be present in case Greal sends someone less polite than himself tomorrow." Nellie stopped walking. Clyde stopped too. They stood on the board sidewalk under a hanging lamp that swayed gently in the evening breeze, and she looked at him with that direct measuring gaze. He met it steadily. There was no condescension in his offer, no implication that she could not handle herself. It was simply practical help offered by someone who had knowledge she did not. "That is a reasonable precaution," she said finally. Something eased in his expression. "His name is Gus Morales. He will meet you at the Henshaw gate at first light." Understood, she started walking again. "Thank you, Mr. Carson." "Clyde," he said, falling back into step with her. She glanced at him. "We are not on first-name terms. We could be." "I will consider it." He smiled at that, the real smile this time, and it did something inconvenient to the general region of her chest that she chose not to examine. Gus Morales was at the Henshaw gate before first light, leaning against the post with a rifle slung across his back and a thermos of coffee in his hand that he wordlessly offered her when she arrived. He was a compact man of perhaps 35 with a serious face and quick dark eyes, and he introduced himself with a handshake that was firm and businesslike. He did not ask questions about her work or offer opinions on it. He simply walked a respectful distance behind her as she set up her equipment and began the final section of the survey, his eyes on the surrounding land rather than on what she was doing. It was the right kind of help, the invisible kind. She was at the southern boundary stake, the last one, making her final measurements, when she heard riders coming from the south. Not 3 this time, 5. And Gus was suddenly standing beside her rather than behind her, not blocking her but present, his hand resting near but not on the rifle. Greal rode in front again. His expression was different today. The smooth diplomacy was gone. "Miss Langley, I think you and I have gotten off on the wrong foot." His voice was still controlled, but there was an edge underneath it now, the way you can hear the steel in the floor of a wooden building when you tap it with a boot heel. "I have made inquiries about you, and I understand you are quite competent at your work. But competence does not mean infallibility, and I wonder if you have considered that your reading of this boundary might be influenced by the person who hired you." "My readings are based on physical survey markers and legal documents," Nellie said, not looking up from her theodolite. "They are not influenced by anything except the actual location of those markers." "The county attorney is a personal friend of mine," Greal said. "Then he will be pleased to receive an accurate survey report," Nellie said, and looked up to meet his eyes. "Because his professional obligation is to the law, not to you." There was a silence that felt like stretched leather. Greal's men shifted in their saddles. Gus was absolutely still beside her with the watchful calm of a man who knows how to wait. "You are very sure of yourself," Greal said. "I am sure of my survey," Nellie said. "Good morning, Mr. Greal." He held her gaze for 5 seconds that felt longer. Then he turned his horse and rode away, and this time the way he did it felt like a promise rather than a retreat. Gus watched them go until they were a half-mile south. Then he exhaled slowly. "That man has an ugly way of being polite," he said. "He does," Nellie agreed, and went back to her measurement. She finished the survey that afternoon and rode back to town with Gus, who delivered her safely to the saloon door and tipped his hat and left without fanfare. Nellie went upstairs and spent 4 hours writing the most meticulous survey report she had ever produced, knowing that it needed to be unassailable. When she came down for supper, Clyde was at a corner table. He looked up when she walked in, and she made a decision without really making it and walked over and sat across from him. "Your man Gus is excellent," she said. "He is the best I have," Clyde said simply. Greal came out again, 5 men this time. Clyde's jaw tightened. "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly. He reminded me that the county attorney is his friend." "Which is true incidentally." "I know, but my report will be filed with the state land office as well, and Greal does not have a friend there." She paused. "I finished the survey. The results are clear. Clara Henshaw owns everything she thinks she owns, including the creek. Clyde leaned back in his chair and looked at her with something that was more than admiration, and less than something she was not ready to name. She is lucky you came. She wrote a good letter, Nellie said. She was clear about what she needed and why she needed it. I appreciate clarity. Is that so? He said it without inflection, which somehow made it more present. Hector brought them supper without being asked, apparently having decided that they were a unit for the evening, which Nellie noticed and did not correct. They ate and they talked, and this time the conversation opened up the way a trail opens when the brush thins, gradually and then suddenly quite wide. She told him about a survey she had done in the hill country 2 years ago, a huge tangled mess of overlapping land grants from the Spanish era, and the months it had taken to untangle them. He told her about coming to Texas from Missouri at 17 with nothing but a horse and a season's wage saved, and how he had spent 5 years as a drover before saving enough to buy a small stake and build from there. He talked about cattle with the same specific technical love that she used when she talked about boundary measurements, and she found it charming in a way she was not expecting. "You love it," she said at some point. "The land, you actually love it. Do not you?" She thought about it honestly. "I love what land means, what it says about where things are and where the boundaries are and how the world is ordered, but love the land itself." She paused. "I think I might. I've just never stayed anywhere long enough to feel it take hold." He looked at her steadily across the table. "How long have you been surveying?" "4 years. Where have you been in that time?" "Everywhere east of El Paso and north of San Antonio," she said. "I go where the work is." "Do you have somewhere you call home?" The question landed differently than she expected it to. She looked at her coffee cup. "My father is still in Austin. That is the closest thing." "What about people your own age, friends?" "Company?" She looked up at him. "I have been told repeatedly that I am too complicated for most people to bother with, Mr. Carson. I am direct to the point of being difficult. I know more than most men about things they consider their domain, and I make it obvious. I have no patience for small talk and even less for pretension. I do not fit neatly into any category that makes people comfortable." She said all of it plainly, as she always did, as a kind of preemptive explanation. She had learned it was easier to lay it out than to have people discover it and feel deceived. Clyde Carson did not look put off. He did not even look surprised. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on the table, and looked at her with those impossible creekwater eyes and said, "I have been looking for complicated my whole life." The words fell into the space between them and did not dissipate. Nellie stared at him. She was not easily caught off guard, and she was caught off guard. "You do not know what that means," she said, recovering. "I think I might have some idea," he said. "Simple things do not hold my interest. Simple people say what everyone expects and want what everyone expects, and nothing ever surprises you. I have spent enough time being bored by simple to know it is not what I want." He held her gaze without wavering. "You are the most interesting person I have sat across a table from in 10 years of eating in this saloon." "You are being forward," she said. "I am being honest," he said. "There is a difference, and I think you know it." She did know it. That was the problem. She went up to her room that night and stood at the small window looking out at the main street of Dusty Creek, the dark outline of the limestone hills against the star-thick sky, and she felt something she had carefully not felt for a long time, which was the desire to stay somewhere long enough for it to take hold. She told herself she had work to finish. She told herself she was going to Austin after this job. She told herself Clyde Carson was a cowboy who lived on a cattle ranch in a small county in South Texas, and that was the fullest extent of what he was. She did not particularly believe any of it. The next morning she delivered her survey report to Clara, walked her through every finding, and gave her the name of a state-level land attorney in Austin who would know how to proceed if the county gave her trouble. Clara held the report in both hands like it was made of something precious. "This is everything," Clara said. "It should be," Nellie said. "Keep the original in a safe place. Have copies made before you do anything with it." "What do I owe you?" They settled on a figure that was fair but not excessive, because Clara Henshaw's situation was what it was, and Nellie was not in the business of squeezing widows. Clara tried to add a sum on top, and Nellie refused it with the polite firmness she applied to all refusals. "You came all this way," Clara said. "I came because you needed someone who could do the work. That is what I was paid for." Nellie paused, then added more gently, "Your husband was right about the land, Mrs. Henshaw. The survey holds." Clara cried then, quietly and without embarrassment, and Nellie sat with her for a while at the kitchen table and drank another cup of the too-strong coffee and did not try to fill the silence with words. She had planned to leave the following morning. She went back to town, settled up with Hector for the room, and was packing her saddlebags when she stopped and looked at the wall for a long moment and then unpacked them again. She told herself it was because she wanted to see Greel's response to her report before she left. She told herself it was professional caution. She told herself a number of things that were all partially true and none of them the whole truth. She went downstairs and asked Hector for another 2 nights in the room. He gave her the key without comment, but she saw the small smile he was trying not to have. Clyde came into the saloon at noon, which she was beginning to understand was his habit on Wednesdays, and his face when he saw her still there did something entirely unguarded that she knew she was going to think about for a considerable amount of time. "Miss Langley," he said, "I thought you were leaving today." "I reconsidered," she said. "Professional reasons." "Of course," he said, and he was absolutely not smiling, which meant he was absolutely smiling. They ate lunch together. He told her about the boundary dispute with his northern neighbor, a man named Aldrich, who was claiming that the creek that ran along Clyde's northwest fence actually ran 5 yards west of where Clyde's fence stood, which would put a good strip of Clyde's best grass on Aldrich's side. "I know you said you were here for one job," Clyde said carefully. Nellie looked at her soup. "Tell me about the original deed." He told her. She asked questions. The more he described, the more she could see the shape of it. And it was a different problem than the Henshaw situation, but not a particularly difficult one, with the right tools and the right starting points. "If you can get me a copy of the original county plat map from 1875 and access to your northeast corner stake," she said, "I could give you a preliminary assessment in an afternoon." He was very still for a moment. "You would do that?" "It is what I do," Nellie said. "You would pay the standard rate." "Of course," he said, still very carefully, not having any expression on his face that was out of place. "You can stop trying to be neutral," Nellie said. "You are transparently pleased." Clyde laughed, the surprised real laugh, and it happened again, that inconvenient thing in her chest. They rode out to the Carson ranch the next morning, and seeing it shifted something in her understanding of him. It was not as grand as Greel's operation, but it was substantial, built with the particular care of a man who intends to stay. The main house was modest and well kept, the barn solid, the pastures fenced with the kind of attention that spoke of real love for the work. There were 6 hands she could see, all working with the steady competence of people who had been doing their jobs for a while. Clyde showed her the northeast corner stake and gave her the county plat copy he had retrieved the day before from the county clerk's office. She set up her theodolite and began taking measurements while he watched from a respectful distance, near enough to answer questions and far enough not to hover. After 2 hours she had what she needed. She walked back to where he was leaning against the fence with his arms crossed and his eyes on the distant hills. "Your fence is in the right place," she said. "Aldrich is wrong." He exhaled slowly. "Can you prove it to a court?" "I can prove it to a judge and his dog," Nellie said. "You will need a proper report from me, and you will need to file it correctly with the county, but the markers support you completely." He looked at her for a moment with something so uncomplicated and warm that it nearly embarrassed her. "Thank you, Nellie," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, and she had not corrected the Clyde the previous evening when he had used it, so she supposed they had arrived at first names without formally negotiating them, which was very much like him. She was beginning to understand. Things arrived with Clyde Carson without making a fuss about it. They simply were. "You are welcome, Clyde," she said, and turned back to her equipment. She wrote up the report that afternoon at the small writing table in her room and delivered it to him at the saloon that evening. He reviewed it with genuine attention, reading carefully and asking 2 questions that were exactly the right questions, and she thought that there was nothing more unexpectedly attractive than a person who read carefully. "I will take this to my attorney in San Antonio," he said. "That would be the right move," she said. "Aldrich can contest it, but he will lose." Clyde set the report down and looked at her across the table with the directness that was, she had accepted by now, simply part of how he was. "I want to do something to thank you," he said. "Beyond paying you, which I will do, but something else. Would you let me cook you supper at the ranch tomorrow evening?" Nellie considered this. "You cook? My mother taught me before she died," he said, "and I have had years to practice on men who eat anything put in front of them, which means I have had no fear of criticism and have therefore developed actual skill." She could not suppress the smile entirely and did not try very hard. "That is a fair argument," she said. "All right." The following evening she rode out to the Carson ranch, as the sun was beginning its long descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in the particular shades of orange and rose that made the Texas landscape look like something from a painting, made up by someone who had never seen it, but somehow got it exactly right. He had set a table on the front porch, rough-hewn boards covered with a clean cloth, with actual candles in glass holders that had been in the house since the previous decade at least, and he cooked a meal of venison stew with cornbread that was so genuinely good that she stopped being polite about it and simply told him so plainly. "This is the best meal I have had in months," she said. "Months," he repeated. "Not years. I ate in San Antonio in February. There is a restaurant there run by a woman from Louisiana who does things with spices that would make angels argue." He laughed. "That is a fair exception." They sat on the porch as the evening came on and the stars began to appear, one by one and then all at once, as they do on clear Texas nights when there is no town close enough to dim them. The hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the ranch was quiet except for the sounds of cattle settling and a nighthawk calling somewhere to the east. "How old are you?" she asked at some point, which was not the kind of question she usually asked, but the evening had a different texture than her usual evenings. 28, he said. "And you?" 26. He nodded. They looked at the stars. "Do you ever want to stop moving?" he asked. The question was quiet and serious, and she took it seriously. "I have not allowed myself to think about it very carefully," she said. "Moving is practical. The work is where the work is. But if you could choose, if work were not the constraint." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I would want a place where what I did mattered, where the work connected to something larger than just the next job, a place that needed someone like me on a more permanent basis." She paused. "I have not found that place yet." He looked at her with an expression that was open in a way she was not used to seeing on a man's face. Not vulnerable, exactly, but honest in the way that only comes when someone has decided you deserve honesty. "Dusty Creek has needed a county surveyor for 6 months," he said. "Since old Breckenridge retired, the county pays a salary and there is a proper office in the courthouse that has been sitting empty." She looked at him. "Are you suggesting I apply for the county surveyor position?" "I am mentioning that the position exists," he said carefully. "What you do with that information is entirely your business." She looked back at the stars. Her heart was doing something she had not authorized it to do, running ahead of her careful reasoning like a horse that has decided it knows the way home better than its rider. "That would be a significant decision," she said. "It would," he agreed, and said nothing else, because he understood she was coming to realize that she needed to arrive at things on her own and that pushing would only create resistance. He had, in some way she could not fully account for, already learned how she worked. She rode back to town that night with the stars very bright overhead and the smell of the spring range in the dark air, and she thought about it all the way back. The next morning, Greal made his mistake. She was coming out of the dry goods store with a new pencil and a block of fresh surveying paper, when one of Greel's men stepped off the sidewalk in front of her. He was a large man with a manner that was designed to make you feel small. "Mr. Greel wants to know if you have thought better of your conclusions," the man said. Nellie stopped. "Tell Mr. Greel that my conclusions are based on physical evidence and legal documentation and are not subject to reconsideration." "He is prepared to make it worth your while," the man said, with the particular heavy emphasis of a man who expects money to handle things. "I do not adjust my surveys based on what anyone is prepared to make worth my while," Nellie said. "And if Mr. Greel attempts to interfere with or tamper with my report, I will personally file a complaint with the Texas General Land Office in Austin and the State Attorney General's office, and I will name him specifically." "Is that clear?" The man blinked. Clearly he had expected a different kind of conversation. "I said, is that clear?" Nellie said. "Yes, ma'am," he said after a moment. She walked past him and did not look back. The story of this exchange was apparently all over the saloon by supper, because Hector told her about it with the kind of delighted specificity that only comes from multiple witnesses. Clyde heard it too, she knew, because she saw the expression on his face when she came down for the evening and he was already there, and it was the expression of a man who has just had something confirmed. "You told Greel's man about the State Attorney General," he said when she sat down. "He needed to understand the stakes," Nellie said. "You are absolutely remarkable," Clyde said, with a simplicity that was entirely without performance. Nellie looked at him. She had been looked at with admiration before. She had been looked at with attraction. She had been looked at with the particular kind of interest that men directed at her when they thought it would get them somewhere. What Clyde Carson looked at her with was different from all of those things. It was the specific regard of a person who sees you clearly, the actual you, the one underneath all the practical capability and the directness and the self-sufficiency, and finds that person genuinely wonderful. It was the most disarming thing she had ever experienced. "Do not say things like that," she said, not harshly. "Why not if they are true?" "Because it makes it difficult to be reasonable," she said. He smiled slowly. "Maybe being reasonable is overrated." She looked at him for a long moment. "Clyde, yes, I am going to think about the county surveyor position." The smile that came over his face was not triumphant or satisfied. It was simply happy, the uncomplicated joy of a man who has just learned that something good might happen. "That is all I asked," he said. "You did not ask anything." "I mentioned a thing that existed," he said serenely. She shook her head, but she was smiling and she did not attempt to hide it. Over the following week, two things happened in parallel. The county received her survey report regarding the Henshaw property, and Nellie began to understand that she was in serious danger of being in love with Clyde Carson. The first thing was satisfying and professionally complex. The county attorney, whose friendship with Greel was real but apparently had limits he was unwilling to cross in broad legal daylight, accepted the survey report and forwarded it to the county commissioner's board with his recommendation that the Henshaw complaint be upheld. Greel filed a counter-objection, claiming the original 1871 survey was flawed. Nellie responded in writing, citing the specific iron markers and their documented provenance, and the board voted 3-2 to uphold the Henshaw claim. Greel threatened to appeal. The state land attorney Nellie had recommended to Clara filed a preemptive motion with the state land office, supported by Nellie's report, and the appeal was essentially neutralized before it could gain traction. When Nellie rode out to tell Clara the news, Clara held both of her hands again, and this time the tears were simply the plain evidence of relief, and Nellie found that her own throat was unexpectedly tight. "Thomas would have been so glad," Clara said. "He would have been right," Nellie said. "He was right the whole time." The second thing, the thing about Clyde, was less satisfying and more complicated in the ways that mattered. She spent time at the ranch. Initially, it was to complete a proper detailed survey for his Aldrich dispute, which required 4 days of careful measurement work along the northwest boundary. Clyde rode with her for parts of it, not to help, but simply because it was his land and he knew it, and could answer questions about what she was seeing. She learned from him the particular history of each section, where the cattle preferred to graze in different seasons, where the grass grew thick over a buried spring, where the ridge cut the wind and made a shelter that was warmer by 10 degrees in winter. He talked about the land the way she talked about maps, with specificity and love, and she began to understand that what he did was its own kind of cartography. In the evenings sometimes they sat on the porch again. He made coffee, and she brought the biscuits from the bakery in town that were not as good as Clara's but were better than average. They talked about everything: his years as a drover and the particular loneliness of moving cattle across a vast country for months at a time, with only weather and landscape for context. Her time at the General Land Office in Austin at 18, the only woman in an office of 12 men, learning to inhabit the space she was entitled to despite every signal that she was an inconvenience. Did they make it difficult? He asked one evening. Constantly, she said. Not all of them. 2 of them were kind and 1 was genuinely helpful. The others resented that I could do the work better than most of them and showed it in the usual ways. The usual ways, he repeated. Being slow to answer questions, losing documents I needed, making comments that were designed to remind me I was out of place. She said it plainly as facts. He was quiet for a moment. And you stayed. I stayed because I was right to be there, she said. Leaving would have been accepting their assessment of the situation. He looked at her with that deep steadiness. You are one of the strongest people I have ever known. I am pragmatic, she said. No, he said. You are strong. Pragmatic is the way you describe it because you do not want to claim the word strong, but it is the right word. She did not answer him right away. She looked at the darkening hills and felt something settle and shift inside her, the way topography shifts along a fault line, not catastrophically but profoundly. Clyde, she said. Yes. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the patience of a man who has learned that some things cannot be rushed and is genuinely fine with that. I applied for the county surveyor position, she said, this morning before I came out here. He was absolutely still for 3 full seconds. Then he said very quietly, Nellie. I spoke with the county commissioner. They are interested. They want references, which I can provide. The salary is adequate and the work would be meaningful. She paused. There would be need for a permanent office. You could use the courthouse office, he said. It is properly equipped. I know, she looked at her hands. I am telling you because you should know, before we continue having supper on your porch, what my intentions are regarding this county. And what are they? He was so careful with her, so perfectly calibrated to the way she needed things to be. She had never been known in that particular way. They are to stay, she said, for a while at minimum. He put his hand over hers on the arm of the porch chair, not urgently, not gripping, simply placing it there, warm and present and without any demand. I am glad, he said. She turned her hand over and let her fingers close around his. She got the position. The county commissioners' board met the following week, and she presented her qualifications in person, methodically and without embellishment, and they offered her the job at the end of the meeting. The 2 commissioners who were friendly with Greele voted against her, and the other 3 voted for her, and she walked out of the courthouse with a letter of appointment and the key to the office on the ground floor that had indeed been sitting empty for 6 months. She wrote to her father in Austin that night, the longest letter she had written him in years. She told him about Clara Henshaw and the survey and the Aldrich dispute. She told him about the job. She told him, carefully and with uncharacteristic tentativeness, about Clyde Carson. She described him as best she could, which was not as well as she would have liked because she was still taking the full measure of him. Her father's letter came back in 2 weeks. The part that mattered said, Your mother used to say that the best kind of home is the one that feels like you chose it rather than the one that chose you. I think you have found something worth choosing, Nellie. She had to read it twice, and then set it down for a while. The summer came on hot and golden, as Texas summers do, and Nellie settled into the county surveyor's office with the focused pleasure of someone who has finally found a space that fits. She mapped disputed parcels and registered new claims and rode out to the far ends of the county to resolve boundary questions that had been simmering for years without a proper professional to address them. She was methodical and fair and very, very good at her work, and word spread quickly through the county that the new surveyor was not someone to bring a fraudulent claim to. Clyde came to see her at the courthouse office twice in that first month, both times with legitimate questions about his property line near the river, and she answered him professionally and with only slightly more warmth than she applied to other clients. He accepted this with equanimity. He understood that her work was her work and that professional boundaries were something she held with pride. But he also appeared at the saloon on Tuesday evenings, which was when she had taken to eating supper downstairs, and they ate together and talked. And sometimes after supper, they walked the length of Main Street and back in the warm evening air, and she learned more about him in those Tuesday evenings than she had learned about most people in years. He had 2 sisters in Missouri who wrote to him every month. He had a dog named Pepper who had died the previous autumn after 14 years of faithful service, and whose absence he still felt visibly when he thought about it. He had read every book he could get his hands on as a boy, and still ordered them from the San Antonio bookseller when he could spare the money. He loved mathematics in the particular way that a mind loves the thing it is built for, not as a school subject, but as a structure for thinking. He had once, at 22, proposed to a woman in San Antonio who had declined because she wanted a man who would stay in the city, and he had been sad about it for a year, and then realized she had been right about him and stopped being sad. "Were you in love with her?" Nellie asked. "I thought I was," he said. "I think now I was in love with the idea of being in the right place at the right time, and she happened to be there, which is not the same thing and is not fair to either person." Nellie walked beside him in the warm evening dark. "And now," he looked at her, "now I think I understand the difference between those 2 things," he said, "and I do not have to choose between them." She stopped walking. He stopped too. They stood on the board sidewalk in front of the dry goods store, which was closed for the night, its window dark behind the glass. The stars were out. A horse moved at the hitching rail across the street. Somewhere a door opened and closed, and a woman's laughter floated briefly on the warm air. Nellie looked at Clyde Carson and understood that she was in love with him. Not in the soft, uncertain way she might have felt at 20, but in the specific, clear-eyed, fully chosen way of a person who has looked at something carefully from every angle and decided it is exactly what it appears to be. "Clyde," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly. I expect nothing less from you," he said. "I love you," she said. "I am telling you directly because that is how I do things, and because I think you deserve to hear it plainly rather than have to interpret it from context." He looked at her for a moment that felt enormous. "Nellie Langley," he said, and his voice had something in it she had not heard before, something that was not his usual warmth but was deeper than warmth, more fundamental. "I have been in love with you since the night you told me you were too complicated for most people, and said it like it was simply a fact you had accepted. And I thought, that is the most remarkable thing I have ever heard someone say about themselves." She felt something unlock in her chest that she had not known was locked. "That was only the second time we spoke," she said. "Sometimes you know quickly," he said. "Sometimes complicated is immediately recognizable as exactly what you have been looking for." She stepped forward. He met her. The kiss was quiet and certain, and felt like finding a survey marker exactly where the record said it would be, which was the most specifically romantic thought she had ever had in her life, and she noted it privately and was not embarrassed by it. He held her face in both hands as gently as if she were something extremely precious, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart under her palms, steady and real and present. They stood there on the board sidewalk under the Texas stars for a long time. Autumn came, and with it several things. Greel's appeal of the Henshaw boundary decision reached the state level and was reviewed by the State Land Commissioner's office, which had received Nellie's full report and the documentation from Clara's attorney. The appeal was denied in September, and the decision was final. Clara Henshaw owned her land, including the creek, and that was the end of it. Greel was furious in the way of men who are very rarely told no, but there was nothing left to do, and he knew it. Clara threw a small supper to celebrate, just herself and Nellie and a few neighbors who had supported her through the dispute, and at the end of the evening she pressed an envelope into Nellie's hands that contained a sum considerably more than the additional fee she had refused in the spring. "I know you will try to give it back," Clara said. "I am asking you not to. You changed my life, Nellie. You gave me back what Thomas built. Let me do this." Nellie looked at the envelope and then at Clara's face and did not give it back. Clyde's Aldrich dispute was resolved in October when Nellie's survey report was submitted, and Aldrich, confronted with unambiguous documentation, withdrew his claim rather than pursue a case he could not win. Clyde did not make a large thing of this. He simply told her when it was resolved and said thank you in the specific way he had, direct and without qualification. She had moved out of the room above the saloon in August, into a small house on the north end of Main Street that the county had provided as part of her surveyor position. It was modest: 2 rooms, a good stove, a proper table, a window that faced east and caught the morning light with the particular quality she had come to think of as hers. She had furnished it simply and well, brought 2 crates of books from Austin, and hung her father's old surveying maps on the wall in the main room. Clyde had helped her move in, carrying crates and setting up shelves with a workmanlike efficiency, and when it was done he had stood in the middle of the main room and looked at what she had made of the small space and said, with complete sincerity, "This is exactly like you." "Is that a good thing?" she asked. "It is a wonderful thing," he said. He had kissed her in the east-facing window light, and she had let herself stay in that moment without cataloging it or analyzing it. She had simply been in it. November arrived with the particular dry cool of a Texas autumn, and with it a letter from Nellie's father, James Langley, who wrote to say that he had been watching his daughter's life from a distance for long enough, and that he would like to come to Dusty Creek for a visit if she would have him. He was 61 and retired now from the General Land Office, his hands not quite steady enough for the fine work anymore, and he wrote about it with the matter-of-fact dignity of a man who has accepted the limits of the body while still being fundamentally himself. She wrote back immediately, "Come as soon as you can." He arrived in late November on the afternoon stage, a tall man with Nellie's same direct eyes and a white beard he had grown in retirement that made him look like a professor of something important. He shook Nellie's hand first, which was a habit between them, and then he hugged her, which was not a usual habit, and told her something. She introduced him to Clyde that evening at the ranch, where Clyde had prepared supper with the kind of careful preparation that he tried to make look effortless. James Langley sat across the table from Clyde Carson, and the two of them talked about land and cattle and mathematics, and the territorial history of Texas for 4 hours while Nellie listened and felt something deeply, quietly good. After supper, when Clyde had gone out to check on the horses and James and Nellie were alone in the warm kitchen, her father looked at her for a long moment. "He is a serious man," James said. "He is," Nellie said. "He looks at you the way I looked at your mother." Nellie was quiet. "You are happy," her father said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "It is a more complicated version of happy than the simple kind, but I think those are the ones that hold." Her father reached across the table and put his hand over hers in the same gesture she had seen Clyde use, and she realized it was where she had learned to recognize what it meant. "Your mother would have adored this," he said. "All of it. You and the work and this man. She would have been insufferably smug about it." Nellie laughed, which surprised both of them. James Langley stayed 3 weeks, during which time he and Clyde became genuinely good friends over shared interests in mathematics and practical land knowledge. He helped Nellie reorganize the filing system in the county surveyor's office, which had been in disarray from the previous occupant, with the efficient precision of a man who had spent 40 years being meticulous. And on the last evening before he left, he and Nellie sat together at her kitchen table and he told her about her mother, not the way he usually did, abbreviated and carefully managed, but fully, with all the specific details of a life shared. Her laugh, her opinions, her stubbornness, the specific way she had loved him. Nellie listened to all of it and let it matter. At the stage the next morning, James shook Nellie's hand and then hugged her again, and he shook Clyde's hand and held it for a moment longer than the standard length of a handshake. "Take care of her," he said to Clyde. "She takes care of herself considerably better than most people take care of themselves," Clyde said. James looked at him. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right. Take care of each other." Christmas came and went in the quiet way of a first Christmas in a new place, modest and specific and entirely good. Clyde had a tradition of going to the Christmas service at the small Methodist church on the edge of town, and Nellie went with him. And afterward they walked in the cold, bright air, and she tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and thought about traditions, and how some of them are inherited and some of them are made. January was cold and the cattle needed more attention, and Clyde was often out early and late. But on the evenings when she rode out to the ranch, he had always somehow managed to have something warm on the stove and the lamp lit in the window. She had begun to know the layout of his house the way she knew a map, confidently and with affection for the particular shape of it. On a Saturday evening in late January, when the temperature had dropped enough to make the stars look sharp and close, and the whole world felt crystalline with cold, Clyde made dinner and they ate, and he was quieter than usual. Not unhappily quiet, something on his mind quiet. After supper, standing in the kitchen drying a dish while she washed, he said, without any preamble at all, "I would like to marry you, Nellie." She set down the cup she was washing very carefully in the basin. "If you want to," he added, "not as an expectation. I know your position is independent of everything else, and I am not assuming anything about how you want to live your life. But I want you in it permanently and officially, and I want it to be known, and I want to be married to you." He paused. "I realize I should have said this more formally." "You said it perfectly clearly," she said, which was true. "Is clarity enough?" She turned from the basin and looked at him, standing in his own kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder and the lamplight making his face warm and the creekwater eyes very serious. "Yes," she said, "clarity is precisely enough." "Is that a yes to the question?" "Yes, Clyde, it is a yes to the question." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in both hands the way he had the first time, and kissed her in the warm lamplight, and she put her soapy hands against his jacket, and did not care at all. They were married in March of 1883, 1 year almost exactly since she had walked into the Silver Spur Saloon with her satchel full of surveying equipment and her gun belt over her calico dress, and her complete conviction that she did not need a single soul in the room. The ceremony was at the Methodist church, small and simple, which was what they both wanted. Clara Henshaw came and cried openly and with great enthusiasm. Hector Prout and his wife came and brought a bottle of very good whiskey as a wedding gift. Gus Morale stood up with Clyde. The county commissioner who had voted for her surveyor appointment, a broad-shouldered woman named Doris Fitch, who was one of the few female office holders in the county, sat in the front pew and looked pleased with herself in the way of people who know they made a good call. Nellie wore a dress she had ordered from San Antonio, a deep blue that was not a traditional wedding color but was exactly right, and she kept her hair up but let a few pieces fall the way she almost never allowed. She carried nothing fussy. She walked to the front of the church on her own because her father could not make the trip in winter, though he sent a letter that arrived the day before and that she read in private and folded carefully into the pocket of her dress. When Clyde turned and saw her walking toward him, Whatever was in his face in that moment was something she memorized with the thoroughness she applied to survey data, storing it with a precision that would allow her to retrieve it perfectly for the rest of her life. They said their vows without stumbling. She did not cry, which was right for her. He did not either, which she had expected, but there was something in his eyes that was doing something equivalent, and she loved him for it. The reception was at the saloon, which Hector had cleaned up considerably for the occasion, and decorated with cedar branches and early spring wildflowers from the ridge. And there was dancing, which Nellie had not expected to participate in but ended up doing, because Clyde could dance, which was another of those things that arrived without making a fuss. He danced with her in the middle of the Silver Spur saloon floor with the same natural ease he did everything, and she followed him and also led when the music called for it, and they found a rhythm that was exactly like how they talked and worked and were together, two people with their own strong lines who had chosen to put those lines on the same map. She moved into the ranch. The county surveyor office was hers still, and she rode to it 3 days a week and managed the county's surveying needs with the same methodical excellence as before. She brought her books and her father's maps and her brass theodolite to the ranch and gave each thing a proper place, and the ranch absorbed her presence the way it had always seemed to have been waiting for it. Spring came back to Dusty Creek with the full warmth of a Texas April, and with it the news that Clara Henshaw had decided to hire a man from town to help her work the land properly, a widower with grown children who proved to be hardworking and decent. Clara wrote to Nellie that the creek was running well and the grass was thick, and Thomas would have been delighted. Nellie kept every letter in a cedar box she had bought from the dry goods store. In the summer of 1883, she discovered that she was expecting a child. She told Clyde on a Tuesday evening on the porch, plainly and without ceremony, the way she did things. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. He stood up from his chair and came to her and held her with the careful, fierce tenderness of a man who has just been given something he will spend the rest of his life being grateful for. "We are going to need to think about the office schedule," she said, into his shoulder. He laughed. "Yes, we will think about the schedule." She worked through most of the pregnancy, moderating her field survey work in the later months, and focusing on the office and documentation work that she could do without climbing through cedar brush. Her father came for a longer visit in October, this time staying through the early winter, and he and Clyde built an additional room onto the ranch house together, which was not something she had asked for but which she recognized as both practical and profoundly moving. Their son was born in February of 1884, arriving with the determined efficiency of a person who has decided to be somewhere, and is doing it. He was small and dark-haired and had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, which were neither gray nor green and entirely impossible to pin down. They named him James Thomas Carson, for her father and for Thomas Henshaw, who had fought for his land and won, at least in the ways that mattered. James Langley came back in March to see his grandson for the first time, and held the baby with the practiced confidence of a man who had held his own child 26 years ago, and found that the muscle memory does not leave. He sat in the kitchen of the Carson Ranch house with the baby asleep against his chest, and looked around at the maps on the walls and the brass theodolite in its case on the shelf, and the cedar box of letters and the general evidence of his daughter's life, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother was right." "About what?" "She used to say that the most important thing a person can do is find the work they are meant for and the person they are meant with. She said if you are very lucky you get both." He looked at Nellie with the direct eyes she had inherited. "You are very lucky, Nellie." "I know," she said. She meant it absolutely. Clyde came in from the morning check a few minutes later, stomping mud off his boots at the door, and stopped when he saw the scene. His father-in-law asleep in the chair with the baby on his chest, and his wife standing at the window in the morning light with her brass compass in her hand, turning it the way she sometimes did when she was thinking, catching the light off its face in small circling flashes. He stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. She turned and saw him. She lowered the compass and looked at him with all the clarity and directness and complicated, specific love that she was and had always been. He came to her and stood beside her at the window, and she leaned into him without ceremony, just the plain, comfortable fact of it. Outside, the spring was coming on across the Carson Range. The grass was greening along the ridge, and the creek was running with the winter snowmelt, and the sky was the hard, bright blue of April, doing what April does in Texas, which is arrive with an announcement. Everything was waking up. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, measured and documented and real. Nellie thought about the line she had once drawn between herself and the world, the careful boundary she had surveyed and marked and maintained. Too complicated, too direct, too much of herself and too certain about it for most people to bother with. She did not regret that line. It had been accurate and true, and it had protected her until she did not need protection anymore. Until she found the one person who looked at that boundary and did not see a warning but a welcome. She had been right that she was complicated. She had simply underestimated that complicated, in the right hands, was not a limitation but a form of treasure. And Clyde Carson had known that from the beginning. The years built themselves out from there with the deliberate solidity of good survey work. Their second child, a girl they named Eliza, came in the summer of 1886, with more preparation this time and less drama, arriving into a household that had learned how to be its own small country. James Thomas, at 2, received his sister with the cautious interest of someone encountering an unfamiliar topographic feature, and within a month had decided she was acceptable. Nellie continued as county surveyor through all of it, adapting her schedule and her field work to the practical realities of a family without apology and without letting the work diminish. She trained a young assistant named Ray Fuentes, who was 17 when he came to her asking if she would teach him, and who turned out to have a gift for mathematics and a patient attention to detail that reminded her of her father. She taught him everything she knew about the work with the same rigor her father had applied to teaching her, and the pride she felt watching him develop his skill was specific and genuine. Clyde's ranch continued to grow. He bought the adjacent quarter section when the previous owner retired and moved east, adding it to his range with a careful attention to the pasture needs of his herd that reflected the kind of understanding of the land that only comes from years of close study. He and Nellie discussed every major decision about the ranch together at the kitchen table over coffee in the evenings, her brass compass on the table between them, his pencil making marks on rough maps they improved on together. He expanded the cattle operation in 1887 and hired 3 additional hands, including a man named Tobias Good who had worked cattle from Kansas to the Rio Grande, and brought a depth of range knowledge that Clyde valued enormously. Gus Morales was still his foreman, still steady and capable and loyal, now married himself to a woman named Pillar who taught at the county school, and who became one of Nellie's genuine friends, which were a small and carefully chosen group. Clara Henshaw died peacefully in the spring of 1888, at her table with a cup of tea in front of her, and the window open and the creek audible in the distance. The man she had hired to help with the land, whose name was Henry Fowler, had become her close companion in the years since, and he was with her. She left the land to her son in Missouri, who sold it a year later, but not to Warren Greele. The land went to a young family from San Antonio who planted a small orchard along the eastern ridge and built a proper house, and were the beginning of a good long story that was not Nellie's to know, but that she was glad to have made possible. Greele himself sold most of his ranch in 1889 and moved to San Antonio, where he invested in real estate and became someone else's problem. His reach in Dusty Creek diminished considerably once he was gone, and the 2 county commissioners who had been in his orbit found other concerns to occupy themselves with. The county functioned better without his particular kind of influence, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. Nellie's father came to visit each year, spending the autumn months at the ranch, teaching James Thomas about mathematics when the boy was old enough to sit still for it, and teaching me Eliza to whistle, which she learned with great enthusiasm and applied without restraint. James Langley grew older with the graceful stubbornness of a man who has decided to age on his own terms, and he and Clyde and Nellie sat on the porch in the October evenings and talked about things that mattered and some things that did not, and it was among the best parts of every year. On a warm evening in the summer of 1889, when James Thomas was 5 and me, Eliza, was 3, and the ranch was full of the particular golden noise of a household that is operating at full capacity, Nellie sat on the porch at the end of a long day and watched the sun go down over the Carson Range. The land was deep green from a wet summer, and the cattle were spread across it in the comfortable scatter of animals that have all they need. The creek along the ridge caught the last light and held it in small, bright pieces. Clyde came and sat in the chair beside her with 2 cups of coffee and set one at her elbow without a word. She took it without looking away from the view. "Me ate her supper," he reported. "All of it. Everything except the carrots. That is progress. Significant progress." He settled into his chair and looked at the same view she was looking at. "James was asking me today about how the land is measured. He found your compass." She smiled. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to ask his mother." He glanced at her sidelong. "Was that appropriate?" "Entirely appropriate." She drank her coffee. "I will take him out to the north boundary next week if the weather holds. Let him see the measurements for himself. He will love that." "I know." The night came on around them in the way it did here, slowly and completely, and the stars appeared in their thousands over the limestone hills, and the night sounds of the range filled the quiet air. A coyote called somewhere south of the creek. Cattle shifted. The house behind them was warm with lamplight, and the sound of 2 small children being put to bed by the housekeeper they had hired the previous year, a practical woman named Agnes who had firm views about bedtime and excellent instincts about when to give people privacy. Nellie set her coffee cup on the porch railing and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the stars. She thought about walking into the Silver Spur Saloon 7 years ago with everything she owned in a satchel and a certainty that she needed no one. She thought about the woman she had been then, entirely herself, entirely capable, and also, she could see now, braced. Carrying all of her own weight on her own back with a pride that was real but was also partly armor. She was still entirely herself. She was still entirely capable. She was still direct and complicated and uncomfortable for some people, and exactly right for others. But the armor had been replaced by something better. Not the absence of strength, but the presence of someone beside her who was also strong, in different ways and complementary ones, and who had never once asked her to be simpler than she was. She turned her head and looked at Clyde Carson in the starlight. He was watching the land with the specific, loving attention he had always brought to it, his hands loose on the arms of the chair, his profile quiet and completely itself. "I want to tell you something," she said. He turned to look at her. "Tell me." "I was wrong about being too complicated for a cowboy," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Were you?" "I was too complicated for most of them," she said, "but not for the right one." He smiled, the real smile, the surprised doubt of him, one that she had loved from the very first time she heard it. He reached over and took her hand and held it the way he always did, simply and without any need for it to mean anything beyond what it was, which was everything. "I told you," he said. "You did," she agreed. "I said I had been looking for complicated my whole life." "You did," she said again. "You were right." He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed her knuckles in the dark, and she looked back at the stars over the dusty creek range, her land and his land and their children's land, measured and known and fully, exactly, perfectly placed. The creek ran along the ridge in the dark. The cattle breathed and settled. The house behind them was warm and full of the particular evidence of a life built carefully and well. Nellie Langley Carson, County Surveyor of Dusty Creek, Texas, wife and mother and the most complicated woman in the county and proud of every part of it, sat on her porch under the stars and felt the precise, documented, irrefutable truth of her happiness, which was not simple and not small and not anything she had expected, and which was, by every measure she had ever applied to anything, exactly right.